Thank you so much for being here, everybody. My name is Lisa Schnell. I'm an interdisciplinary artist. I'm also a writer, and I have a background in science. And today, I'm going to talk about trees. And I have to say that saying that feels a little bit risky in an organization dedicated to animal conservation. But in this case, I'm seeing trees as a dialogue partner. And so when I say I want to talk about trees, I mean I'm talking about you too, and everything else out in nature as well. I also know from being involved with the mentorship program as a mentee, a mentor, and now as a fellow, that this program and the people involved with it, I really believe they want the best for my work and for me. And today that means trees. So before we get to trees, though, I want to take you to a place that's almost defined by its lack of trees, which is the tallgrass prairies in eastern Kansas. And I was there as a graduate student. I had a 40-acre-old farm field that I was restoring to native prairie. We gathered a lot of the flower seeds by hand, purchased other seeds, and I went around the whole 40 acres, flinging the seeds as evenly as I could across the whole site, and had a farmer drill in the grass seeds as well. And at some point, I took one of my advisors out there with me, and we were talking about how everything was spread so evenly, but there were differences in the landscape. There was an area that was sort of a wetland, and there was an area that was very weedy, and there was an area that was very, very much drier. And we were talking about how we would know about the differences, how we could tell the success of the plants that were coming up. And what she said to me is that you ask the land a question, and it answers in flowers. And I found this so beautiful and poetic, and also incredibly true. And it's especially true in a prairie restoration where we don't know what came before. We don't know what the water was like. We don't know what the animal involvement was like. We don't know what the temperature was. So many differences. And so we start the conversation, and then we iterate, we adapt it as we go along. And lately I've been reflecting on this in a new way, that idea of asking the land a question and that it answers in flowers. I've been thinking about it in terms of language and how we communicate with other. I'm trying to look at the questions of, how we enter a conversation or ask a question, how do we listen to a response with someone or something that is so different from ourselves? What language do we even use? And then what happens to us and also to that other when we have this kind of engagement? So throughout my presentation, I'm going to be sharing some examples of my recent artwork. I'll talk about it in more detail later. For now, I hope you just enjoy the images and take them as some of my attempts to communicate with other. And it's really not just communicating, it's also relying on other in some ways. In my experience, to get to the good stuff, the sort of sticky, messy edges of things that are unpredictable and out of focus, full of possibility and new direction, to get there, I have to get a little lost. And fortunately, I get lost really easily. We joke in our household that I married my husband because he's a geographer. But really, I do need to sort of either throw myself or be thrown out of my usual way of seeing things in order to effectively engage with the creative process. And often that means interacting with some sort of other. So today, I'm going to consider 3 different sort of types of other. One is other people. Another is the more than human world. And I'm using that term kind of like a lot of people might use nature, but in this case, I mean it in part because humans are part of nature, and also the more than human term sort of also reflects the air and the water and rocks and anything else out there in addition to all the plants and animals that we usually think of. So when I was brought in as a fellow, the task given to me was to work to retain mentors in the mentorship program. And I was given a huge amount of latitude in terms of how I would do that, which is really exciting and also a little overwhelming. And so I needed to take a little time to figure out how to clarify my direction and what I wanted to do with that. And the first thing I chose to do in order to figure things out was to conduct a lot of interviews. And in this image, what you see reflected are mentors, mentees, Creature Conserve board members, core team members, scholarship recipients, scientists, artists, writers. There's obviously a variety of ages, and by my count, about 7 different countries represented here. And through these interviews, I was trying to get a variety of information. I wanted to get feedback on the mentorship program itself. I wanted to try to refine and shape my ideas regarding my fellowship project. I also just wanted to connect and start to build community. One of the wonderful benefits that came out of this was, some of these people I've known for years, and but only in sort of a certain way. And through these interviews, I got to know them in a different way. And one of my favorite things, honestly, was, I would start out with a list of questions, but when we went off script, when we got a little lost in the conversation, that was often the best part. So through these conversations, I was able to refine my project a little bit. I took into account my own background with science, a presentation that I'd given a couple of years ago, actually, in this space about artists and scientists, and also just we sort of have an imbalance of artists and scientists within the mentorship program. We tend to attract a lot of artists, and I would love to see more scientist involvement. So I chose to focus on retaining and also hopefully bringing in more scientists to the program. So in the big picture, I think one of the questions that's important to consider is how can we encourage more scientists to develop an ongoing collaborative relationship with artists, especially through the mentorship program. But the reality is that we just need to get them more involved in the first place. And so partly I was, trying to figure out how to do that. And one of the things I discovered is that we have a bit of a language barrier. There are so many similarities between artists and scientists. I'm not going to list them out here, but especially within the conservation biology space, we're really all on the same team. And I think sometimes we end up pitted against each other, but we're really on the same team. And I do think, though, that in subtle but important ways, we speak different languages. If you think about how a conceptual artist might talk about their work versus a fisheries biologist, for example, there's going to be terms that are very different that make it sometimes challenging to interact. Sometimes it's actual jargon, and sometimes it's familiar words that get used in a very different way in different contexts. So, for example, the word tools or methods or research can mean very different things to these different groups of people. So I want to start to define a common language, and I want to start with the word collaborate. To me, this word has to do with two parties, whether it's an individual or groups coming together, and they explore maybe a question or a problem together, and they end up someplace where neither of them would have gone on their own. It doesn't mean that we eliminate or ignore the differences between them. It does mean that we acknowledge them and that everybody has a chance to share their perspective, and that in the end, we end up someplace new. So as part of my fellowship project, one of the things that I wanted to do was to develop a program. And the idea that I'm working on is to bring in pairs, so a scientist and an artist, preferably people who have worked together before, for example, maybe mentorship pairs. Right now, just to give an easy example, in our mentorship cohort, we have a cellist and voice artist who's working with a seal scientist. I think they would be great to bring in to talk about their work. If the scientist might feel a little bit uncomfortable coming in, we can let them talk about their work, which is what scientists are often asked to do, and also have the artist talk about their work. And then importantly, have the two of them talk together about what it's like to collaborate. And then as another part of the program, what I'd love to see happen is to have the participants break into small groups. And even if they don't know each other, have any prior history, to develop a hypothetical collaborative project right then and there. I think that we toss around this word collaboration all the time, and it's a wonderful word. But it's also challenging to actually do. And I think, if we can find a space to give people an opportunity to practice and to get feedback on how that process would work, it could be really beneficial to a lot of people. There's also another idea that I want to mention. It's one I've thought a lot about. I haven't quite figured out how to work it into a program, but maybe that'll happen eventually. And that's the idea of seeing scientists as a whole person. I think we often think of science in terms of what comes out in a scientific paper. But I can tell you from my experience in the field that is not all there is to science. There's so much more that you see and learn about and think about and feel, anecdotes and observations and that kind of thing that never make it into a scientific paper. But there's not really a space for that. And I would love to, start to work into that a little bit and see where we could take it. Is there a way that we could allow for scientists to start to express some of maybe the grief that they're feeling if their study site or study organism is in decline, or if their funding has gotten cut or something like that? Is there a place for that, for those scientists as whole people to express and work on something? That's another thing that I've been thinking about. A few other things from my interviews that came up. One is the idea to attend scientific meetings, which I know there's been some talk in this community before. A great suggestion that came out was to create a sort of digital flip book. So something that could be quickly and easily absorbed by somebody who's not necessarily involved with our community already, who might want to see the kinds of projects that we can create here. The idea is, if you go up to a scientist and say, hey, do you want to be involved with an artist? They're like, sure, I'd love to have some illustrations for my scientific paper. But there's so much more that artist and scientist collaboration can do. And I think if we could share some of that in a quick and easy way, it would really start some interesting wheels turning. I also have some more connections and insight that I think would be great to follow up in. I was able to speak with the woman who started the program Skype a Scientist. Thank you very much to Catherine Fletcher, who Natalie mentioned in her project. She passed the contact information along, and this program matches scientists with classrooms, but the director said that they often end up with way more scientists than they can match, and those people are often looking for something else to get involved with. And I think Creature Conserve would be a great match for them, and she would be happy to share our contact information with them. So I've also spoken with a scientist who has been to the COP events and has worked with musicians there. She's excited to come and talk with the Creature Conserve community. I've also spoken with a hydrologist who would love to come and talk with us. So there's lots of people who are out there who would love to be involved. But I promised you trees, so let's get back to the more than human world here. A couple months ago, it was winter. We had a nice cold winter, which was great, but it meant we're a little more cooped up inside. I was stuck on my program and also very much stuck in my head. I knew that I wanted an art component to my fellowship project, and I really was not at all sure what that was going to be. I've been thinking a lot about this idea of language and communicating with other, but visually, I just had truly no clue what to do with that. So I needed to get out of my head, out of my own way, and all of that. And I generally find that movement and motion are extremely helpful in sort of shaking things up a bit for me. There's a book that I've read called The Extended Mind by Annie Murphy Paul. If you haven't read it, I definitely recommend it. She talks about something called interactivity in there, which I won't go into here a lot, but basically it sort of involves thinking with your hands. So again, back to Natalie, sort of thinking by doing and figuring it out as you go along the way. So I knew that I wanted to work larger than I had been working in my artwork, and I had a vague sense that I wanted to collaborate with the landscape. I didn't really know what that meant. I wasn't at all sure where that idea would go. And so it's sort of in a fit of frustration, I went outside into the cold and dusk and wind, and I tied a bunch of paper onto trees. And I called this my Weird Paper Tied to Trees project. It has evolved a bit, but that's how it started. And so here are some of the early examples of that. And along with that, so sorry, it's not just paper. I had put some pigments on there. Some of this is charcoal that I made and found and ground up, and some of it is walnut ink that I've made using black walnut trees that grow on our property. And sort of more about that just in terms of the materiality. I was trying to use materials that I like and that feel good to me. I was also really trying for low impact and handmade to the extent that I could. So you can also see here a couple of eggs from our hens. I incorporated some of the yolks as a binder into the charcoal and the walnut ink to make a sort of paint, and even use some of their feathers in order to apply that paint. And this is an example of some lines I made with the handmade charcoal, and it's tied onto one of our black walnut trees. I also want to mention here too that some of these ended up outside for days, weeks, even going now on months, just to see sort of how they would change over time. And I also made some paper. And the first paper I made started out, I used this very old molden decal that I've had around for eons. And I started out trying to make it as smooth and flat and perfect as I could possibly make it. And I have to say that did not last long. I pretty quickly went to the hardware store and found some inexpensive large screens that I could try to make bigger paper on. And I used some of those pieces to apply it to apply the pigments to some of that handmade paper, and then also attached that to the trees. And I also, again, in thinking about my interviews, went out and interviewed one of our walnut trees. So I used a feather dipped in the walnut ink and wrote out my interview questions and just kept writing and layered them until it became abstracted, and let that dry and then tied that onto a tree. So, in talking with Derek about this, we sort of were exploring some of the things that were working better, and both agreed that the handmade paper was some of the more interesting work. And so I decided to sort of push into that a little bit more and see what I could do with it. The original paper that I made was from those little produce containers. If you've seen those, that's with that blue, there's more pictures of it, and also some junk mail. So here I was trying to make it a little bit more personal. These, I tend to take a lot of notes, write a lot of notes, and so these are some of those notes shredded up. There's grocery lists in there. There's maps from my husband, who's a geographer. We tend to use maps as wrapping paper. And so it all ended up in the blender. And then I was experimenting to see what else I could do with it. So I've made sheets of paper. What else could I try? And I tried putting it onto some twigs to see what that would do. I also poured some onto some big chunky pieces of bark. So the piece that you see on the left, that's actually the paper that I pulled off of that piece of bark that's on the right. And then I was also just playing with organic shapes and colors to see sort of what I could pull out of this experiment. There's one example of that, and another. And then I was also contemplating, which trees do we have that are maybe of a little bit more importance or interest to me? So this is a white pine tree. We've planted trees for our various family members. This is the one that's from our younger daughter. And so this is one of the handmade sheets of paper with charcoal powder rubbed into it and tied onto the white pine tree. Partly what I was doing here in these iterations is setting it up so I might be able to recognize a response, because remember, part of this is like trying to interact and listen to the more than human world. And so this is charcoal powder without any binder in it, because I was hoping it would move a little bit more in the weather. This is another example. This is a pussy willow that we have growing, and the original cutting came from my grandmother. For better or worse, it's sort of planted in this tiny little scrappy corner of our property, but I kind of wanted to show you the behind the scenes story, because it's nice to make all these things look glamorous, but the reality is that sometimes they're not. So there's the pussy willow tree, and there's the piece of paper that I tied onto it. And then I also put one more down on what I call our sentinel tree. It's a big sycamore tree down by the creek that runs through our property. And that was fun, just to go down there and try to wrap this piece of paper around this massive tree. Okay, so I mentioned this idea of trying to read the responses and see. And so in the picture on the left, you can see a thin blue line. That was originally a bright blue piece of handmade paper, is from those little produce containers. But the blue line is all that's left after everything faded. And that's just where the twine was. So I thought that was a sort of decent response. Over on the right, you can also see that's that same pussy willow paper, and that is, you can see some of the lines where the charcoal moved a little bit in the rain. And in the middle there is down near the sycamore tree, just going down there, I noticed that, now that it's springtime, the skunk cabbage is up. And while I was there, there was a little bee going from flower to flower, and it had this really full pollen basket. So it's a response both in the materials that I use, but it's also in me, because it got me outside more and it got me noticing things that I might not have seen otherwise. And then this piece is one that I have had up for quite a while. It's not blowing in the wind. It's actually kind of become a sculptural piece because it's been up for so long. But I kind of looked at it and I thought maybe it had done all it was going to do. So I went up to it and I was going to take it down. And I got a little closer and I saw this. And I got closer still and I found a little friend. There was this little moth that had taken up whether temporary or permanent residence in this art piece. And I really like that as a response. I've also found some spiders that occasionally check in. And now that it's springtime, some of this work is still up, and I will continue to check back to see if we get any more visitors. So as far as future possibilities, I think there are several with this project. The picture on the left is an example of a monoprint that I tried. So that's taking pretty much the same materials, the egg yolk, charcoal powder, and walnut ink, and making basically a printing ink out of it and creating a monoprint. And then the picture, and so I would love to try more printmaking. The picture on the right is just some of those many different colors of paper, but to me it looks a lot like a map, and I think it would be fun to maybe play around with that as a map. I even see that paper wasp piece down in the bottom right as sort of like, an inhabited zone or something like that. And I also thought it could be fun to even try to get, I don't know how you would do this, but some sort of interspecies collaboration with the paper wasps and my paper. So all sorts of fun ideas there. I could also see some of these pieces becoming, an installation, whether outside or inside. And I'd also love to try making paper from plants directly, which I know is a thing that you can do, just to take it back a notch further, but I haven't figured out how to do that yet. Okay, so I think through all of this, the art has been a way to see old things in a new way. We've lived on this property for over 20 years now, and I'm looking at it, looking at the trees and the land around it in very different ways. And similarly with the interviews, I think getting a little lost in some of those conversations helped me see some of those people in new ways. And similarly, starting out lost with this project helped me see, our land in new ways. So what I'd love to be able to do with all of this is to find a way to use that idea of being lost as a sort of tool to address some of the questions and problems that we're facing, through science. And I'm not sure, I think it's just a matter of finding a way to use that tool of being lost more intentionally. It can feel really uncomfortable, but I think if we go into it on purpose, then we could do some really interesting things with it in terms of artists and scientists interacting. So the last main area, group, whatever, how you want to think about it, in terms of getting lost is self. So how do we get lost in ourselves? And personally, I have a lot of ideas that can be I just tend to just generate a lot of ideas, which can be fun, and it can also be really exhausting. So when I encounter those ideas, some of them seem really weird. I can't always figure out where they came from or what to do with them. I'm not sure which ones to pursue. And And even when I do know, sometimes it can be hard to get myself to sit still long enough to do anything with it. I might get discouraged and walk away. What I've found through the mentorship program, and I would say this is true for me and in terms of other people who I've seen go through the program, is that, to have somebody say, hey, this is beautiful, or this is working, keep going, or, to ask a question, even how do you feel about what you've just done, that can be incredibly helpful. And I've compared it to a nest. I think it can feel really nurturing, again, both for myself and for others. And I also want to think about it in terms of our own selves in the larger community. At so many scales, we are in crisis right now. If you want to take just one example, we could talk about biodiversity. I think when you're trying to face that sort of thing as an individual, it can feel extremely discouraging, overwhelming. It's easy to feel ineffective. But one thing I've heard from multiple people, both in casual conversation and through the actual interviews that I conducted, is that being part of this community can be really comforting, and it can provide a way to find a way to continue on. I think that also, if we think about ourselves being in dialogue or in collaboration, we kind of become the materials. I don't know if you've seen the movie Flow. It's out now, it's an animated movie. And one of the things that I like best about it is that the individual creatures, as a species and as characters, they lean into who they are as individuals to become part of the solution. And I really believe that that is also what we're doing here in the mentorship program. We bring our knowledge and experiences, our ways of interacting with the world around us, our connections. What can we do with all of that when we bring a problem to really focus on, and to allow ourselves to play and get lost and explore with that. I think through collaboration, we can find ways to keep this conversation going, to keep asking questions and listening in lots of different ways. And I guess to touch on our theme of reworlding, I think that we can sort of see this crisis as an opportunity to forge new relationships and take an active role in making the world that we envision. I want to leave you with one more thing this evening before I go. As an icebreaker for all those interviews that I did, I asked people to bring a song and to talk a little bit about it. And the song was to be about animals, or directly or tangentially, to be about animals and or something that had a personal meaning. And I got a really good reaction to that as an icebreaker. And I've taken all those song suggestions and I have created a Creature Conserve community playlist. So I hope that you will take a listen and enjoy it. I will say that there are definitely some funny transitions throughout it, but I still think it's an enjoyable thing. And to end, I just want to say thank you to everybody who has supported me and this project. It's been a really fascinating, wonderful few months, and I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you.